Mr. Jenkins, an elderly black man, had lived a peaceful life for decades, until a group of cruel teens decided to make him their target. Motivated by prejudice and a thirst for chaos, the Sullivan brothers and their gang of misfit friends launched a devastating attack on Mr. Jenkins' home, vandalizing his property and humiliating him in the most brutal ways. Now, let's dive into the story and discover how it all began. Subscribe now to keep enjoying the content. Mr. Jenkins had been living in the quiet, tree-lined street for more years than he cared to count. His house, a testament to his meticulous care, stood out with its freshly painted white fence and well-trimmed lawn. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving a warm, orange glow that painted the neighborhood in a peaceful light. Inside, the smell of his favorite meatloaf filled the air, a comforting scent that had become a staple of his solitary dinners. The neighborhood, however, wasn't as idyllic as it once was. Over the past few years, a subtle shift had occurred. New families had moved in, and with them came a generation of teens who didn't know Mr. Jenkins as the friendly neighborhood handyman, but rather as an outsider in their eyes, a relic of a bygone era. They whispered about him, casting glances filled with suspicion and, at times, hostility. The once welcoming smiles had faded into forced politeness, a stark contrast to the warmth he had once known. The ringleaders of the local pack of troublemakers were the Sullivan brothers, twins with a penchant for racial slurs and a complete lack of empathy. They gathered their usual suspects, a motley crew of teens who craved the power that came from fear and chaos. The brothers spoke in hushed tones, their eyes glinting with malice as they laid out their plan. They had chosen Mr. Jenkins as their latest target, their motivation fueled by boredom and a deep-seated prejudice. Under the cover of darkness, they approached Mr. Jenkins' home, armed with spray cans and an assortment of tools to aid in their destructive mission. They moved swiftly, their laughter echoing through the empty street. They began by shattering windows with a sickening crunch, sending shards of glass tinkling to the ground. Graffiti, crude and hateful, appeared on the once pristine walls, a visual assault on the dignity of the man who had worked so hard to maintain the property. The sound of breaking glass was soon followed by the revving of an engine as they stole the lawnmower, the pride of Mr. Jenkins' gardening endeavors. The vandals broke into his home with surprising ease. Mr. Jenkins, caught off guard by the sudden intrusion, was swiftly overpowered. They bound him with zip ties, the plastic biting into his wrists and ankles, and tossed him into a chair in the corner of his own living room. One of the Sullivans took the lead, taunting him with vile language as the others ransacked the house, tossing his possessions around like they were worthless trash. The room grew colder as the teens destroyed the warm sanctuary he had built for himself over the years, each item holding a memory of his past. The tension reached a climax when one of the more sadistic teens decided to take their spite a step further. He stepped closer to Mr. Jenkins, a twisted smirk on his face, and did the unthinkable. The stench of urine filled the room as he relieved himself on the elderly man's face, the warm stream a degrading symbol of their power over him. Mr. Jenkins' eyes remained closed, his pride the only shield against the humiliation. The teens jeered and took photos, their laughter a nauseating soundtrack to the horror unfolding before them. As the chaos continued, a neighbor who had been walking her dog earlier heard the commotion. She had noticed the group of teens earlier and had felt an uneasy suspicion. Her heart racing, she pulled out her phone and called the police, whispering the address and a description of the perpetrators into the receiver. Unbeknownst to the teens, their hateful rampage was about to come to an abrupt end. The sirens grew louder, their wails a promise of justice on the horizon. Mr. Jenkins, though beaten and degraded, felt a flicker of hope. His nightmare would soon be over, and perhaps, just perhaps, the neighborhood would finally learn the true cost of their ignorance and hate. The police car screeched to a halt in front of the house, blue and red lights flashing, casting an eerie glow across the vandalized lawn. The teens, caught off guard, froze in their tracks. Panic set in as they realized their actions had consequences. The Sullivan brothers, trying to maintain their bravado, urged their followers to flee. They scattered like rats abandoning a sinking ship, leaving their handiwork and their victim behind. Officer Taylor, a veteran of the force with a no-nonsense attitude, stepped into the house, his eyes widening at the sight before him. The living room was a disaster, and Mr. Jenkins sat slumped in the chair, his dignity in tatters. He quickly untied him, his face a mask of disgust at the urine still dripping from the old man's chin. "You okay, sir?" he asked, his voice gruff but filled with concern. Mr. Jenkins nodded weakly, his eyes brimming with unshed tears. "They're gone," he murmured, his voice trembling. Subscribe now to keep enjoying the content. The police swarmed the area, searching for the vandals. Within the hour, the Sullivans and their accomplices were apprehended, their faces a mix of fear and arrogance. The evidence was damning: the stolen lawnmower in their truck, the spray paint on their clothes, and the photos on their phones, a sickening trophy of their crime. As they were read their rights, the gravity of their actions began to sink in, their smirks fading into sneers of defiance. The charges were severe: aggravated assault, burglary, and hate crimes. The neighborhood, once silent in the face of Mr. Jenkins' suffering, now buzzed with outrage. His story spread like wildfire, and a wave of support grew stronger with each shared word. The community rallied around him, offering help to repair the damage and demanding justice for the senseless violence. The local councilor called for a meeting, vowing to address the underlying tensions that had allowed such an atrocity to occur. In the aftermath, Mr. Jenkins' home was slowly restored, the graffiti scrubbed away, the windows replaced, and the stolen items recovered. The town's response was overwhelming, with donations pouring in from far and wide. Yet, the emotional scars lingered. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow in the night, served as a painful reminder of the violation of his sacred space. But amidst the pain, there was also a glimmer of hope. The community had been shaken to its core, and for the first time in a long while, people began to talk openly about the prejudices that had been festering beneath the surface. The Sullivan brothers and their cohorts were brought to trial, their actions laid bare before a judge and jury. Their smirks had vanished, replaced by the cold reality of the harm they had inflicted. The town watched, eager for a verdict that would serve as a lesson to all. And as Mr. Jenkins took the stand to testify, his voice clear and steady, he knew that, though he had been a victim, he had also become a catalyst for change. Perhaps now, the neighborhood would finally learn that love and respect were stronger than fear and hate. The trial was a media sensation, bringing national attention to the quiet community. The Sullivans' parents, who had turned a blind eye to their son's antics for too long, sat in the courtroom, faces pale and drawn. The community watched, hoping that this would be the moment when the tide of ignorance and prejudice would turn. The prosecutor presented a compelling case, detailing the physical and emotional damage the teens had caused. Mr. Jenkins' dignified demeanor in the face of such horror earned him the respect and admiration of many. As the verdict was read, guilty on all counts, a collective sigh of relief filled the room. The judge, a stern woman with a reputation for fairness, sentenced the teens to community service and mandatory diversity training, as well as restitution for the damages. It was a victory, though bittersweet. The punishment was a small price to pay for the pain Mr. Jenkins had endured, but it was a start. Life in the neighborhood began to change, slowly but surely. The vibrant diversity that had once been stifled by fear began to bloom again. Neighbors started to look out for each other, and Mr. Jenkins' front porch, once a lonely bastion, became a gathering place. Children from all backgrounds would come to hear his stories, and the teens who had once taunted him now offered to mow his lawn and help with chores. The house, once a symbol of hate, had become a beacon of hope. In the months that followed, Mr. Jenkins found himself the center of a new kind of attention. Invitations to neighborhood barbecues, offers of friendship, and a sense of belonging that had been stolen from him began to heal the wounds of the past. The town held a community cleanup event in his honor, and the Sullivans, now under strict probation, were forced to participate. They avoided his gaze, but Mr. Jenkins saw the flicker of remorse in their eyes and knew that perhaps, just perhaps, they had learned a valuable lesson. The story of Mr. Jenkins and the bullies who had picked the wrong target became a lesson for the town and beyond. It served as a stark reminder that every person, regardless of age, race, or background, deserves respect. And in the quiet moments, as he sat in his now peaceful living room, Mr. Jenkins reflected on the strange twist of fate that had turned his darkest hour into a catalyst for growth. The neighborhood had changed, and it was all because a group of thoughtless teens had underestimated the strength of one elderly black man and the power of a community that refused to let hate win. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe to help our channel grow.